The morning I walked into my son's house and heard my daughter-in-law Diana call me the broke old lady, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just smiled and kept folding the laundry she'd left on the couch for me to do. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her parents, Richard and Susan Walsh, the ones she bragged about constantly, the ones who supposedly owned half the real estate in the county, used to work for me. 23 years ago, they begged me not to fire them after I caught them stealing from my company's inventory. I'm Eleanor Hartwell, and before I tell you what I did when I finally revealed the truth, I need your honest answer. If your own family humiliated you daily while worshiping people you once employed, would you have stayed silent as long as I did? Or am I a vindictive old woman who should have just let the past stay buried? Keep that thought, because by the end, I want your verdict. I was 67 years old, living in what used to be my guest house, a converted garage apartment behind the main house that my son Marcus and his wife Diana now occupied. The house I'd signed over to them 3 years ago because Diana said it would make things easier for everyone, that I'd be more comfortable in something smaller, more manageable at my age. She'd smiled when she said it, that practiced smile she wore when she wanted something, and Marcus had nodded along like he always did. So I signed the papers because I loved my son and wanted him happy. And for 3 years, I lived in that converted garage, 400 square feet with a kitchenette and a bathroom the size of a closet, while they renovated my former home, knocking down walls I'd built with my late husband Arthur, painting over the soft yellow we'd chosen together, replacing our sturdy oak furniture with minimalist pieces that looked expensive but felt empty. Every morning, I'd wake at 6, make instant coffee because the kitchenette had no real stove, just a hot plate and a microwave. Then I'd walk across the small backyard to the main house, where Diana would already be up. Hair perfect, makeup flawless, sipping her almond milk latte and scrolling through her phone. She never said good morning first. I always had to initiate, and even then she'd barely look up, just mumble something about the dishes needing doing, or the living room needing vacuuming, as if I were the housekeeper instead of Marcus's mother. And maybe that's what I'd become in her eyes. The help. The old woman who had nothing better to do than clean up after them. Marcus worked long hours at the architecture firm downtown, leaving before 7 and rarely home before 8, which meant I spent most days alone with Diana, watching her redecorate rooms I'd once decorated, hearing her on the phone with her friends talking about how exhausting it was having elderly family living on the property, how she couldn't wait until I was settled somewhere more appropriate. She never said nursing home directly, but the implication hung there, heavy and cold. Her parents visited every Sunday, Richard and Susan Walsh, arriving in their black Mercedes, dressed in designer clothes, carrying expensive wine and gourmet cheeses. And Diana would light up, transform into this adoring daughter, rushing to greet them, hugging them tight, exclaiming how much she'd missed them, even though they'd just been there last week, and they'd sweep into my former home like royalty, barely acknowledging me when I served them coffee or brought out the appetizers Diana had demanded I prepare. Once Susan looked right through me as if I were invisible, asking Diana if she'd considered hiring actual help now that the house was so much larger, and Diana had laughed, said she was still thinking about it, and I'd stood there holding a tray of cheese and crackers, my hands shaking slightly, wondering if they'd forgotten that this was my house, that I'd raised Marcus here, that every corner held memories of my life with Arthur before cancer took him 6 years ago. The Walshes loved talking about their success, their real estate empire, the properties they'd developed, the investments that had made them wealthy. Richard would lean back in his chair, expensive watch glinting, and hold court about market trends and profitable ventures, while Susan would chime in with stories about charity galas and country club luncheons, and Diana would sit between them glowing with pride. Sometimes she'd glance at me and I'd catch something in her expression. Not quite pity, but close. as if she were silently comparing her successful, accomplished parents to her husband's sad, elderly mother, who lived in a converted garage and had nothing to show for her life. What Diana didn't know, what I'd never told Marcus, because it seemed petty and small to bring up ancient history, was that 23 years ago, Richard and Susan Walsh had worked for me, not in some high-level capacity, but as warehouse managers at Hartwell Distribution, the logistics company I'd built with Arthur from nothing. We'd started in our garage with one delivery truck and a dream, and over 20 years we'd grown it into a regional operation with 40 employees and contracts with major retailers. Arthur handled the business development and client relations while I ran operations, managed the warehouse, oversaw inventory and shipping, made sure everything ran smoothly, and Richard and Susan had been hired as assistant managers when we expanded. They were young, ambitious, eager to prove themselves, and for 2 years they did good work, showed initiative, stayed late, took on extra responsibilities. I'd even considered promoting them, giving them profit-sharing opportunities, until the day our accountant noticed discrepancies in the inventory reports. Small things at first, a few missing items here and there. But when we dug deeper, we found a pattern: products disappearing from stock, phantom orders that never reached customers, and when I reviewed the security footage, there they were, Richard and Susan Walsh, loading boxes into their personal vehicle after hours, stealing merchandise they planned to resell. They'd taken nearly $30,000 worth of goods over 6 months. Not enough to bankrupt us, but enough to hurt. Enough to betray the trust I'd placed in them. I'd confronted them in my office, Arthur beside me, and I'd watched Richard's face cycle through emotions: shock, denial, panic, then finally pleading. He'd begged, actually gotten down on his knees, said they'd made a terrible mistake, that Susan was pregnant and they were desperate for money, that they'd pay everything back, work for free, do anything if I didn't press charges or report them. Susan had cried, mascara running down her cheeks, hands clasped like she was praying, and Arthur had wanted to call the police immediately, said people like that couldn't be trusted, but I'd looked at Susan's trembling hands resting on her barely visible baby bump and felt something crack inside me. Maybe it was weakness, or maybe it was mercy, but I'd told them they had 2 choices: resign immediately with no reference, or I'd prosecute, and they'd never work in logistics again. They'd chosen resignation, packed their desks that same day, and I'd never seen or heard from them again. Never knew what happened to them, whether they'd struggled or succeeded, whether they'd learned from their mistakes or repeated them. I'd simply moved on, hired better people, built stronger systems, and eventually sold Hartwell Distribution 5 years after Arthur died. Sold it for $4.3 million to a national logistics company that wanted our client contracts and regional presence, and I'd lived quietly on the proceeds, invested wisely, traveled modestly, helped Marcus through college and into his career, and never once mentioned the Walshes because, why would I? They were a footnote in my history. 2 people who'd made bad choices and disappeared from my life until 3 years ago when Marcus brought Diana home for the first time, and she'd gushed about her wonderful parents who'd built their real estate empire from nothing, who were so successful and inspiring, and something about the names had nagged at me. Walsh wasn't uncommon, but Richard and Susan together felt familiar. And then I'd met them at the engagement party, walked into the restaurant, and seen them across the room. Older now, heavier, more polished, but unmistakably the same people who'd stolen from me 2 decades earlier, and they'd looked at me with no recognition whatsoever. No flicker of memory or acknowledgement, just polite smiles and firm handshakes as Diana introduced us. "My future in-laws," she'd said proudly. "Aren't they amazing?" And I'd smiled back and said nothing, because what was I supposed to say? That her parents were thieves who'd begged me not to destroy their lives, that the empire they'd supposedly built from nothing had been jump-started with $30,000 of stolen merchandise they'd never paid back. I'd stayed quiet that night and every night since, watching them rewrite their history, listening to them describe their early struggles without ever mentioning where their first capital had come from. And Diana had absorbed their narrative, believed completely in their self-made success story, used it as a weapon to diminish me, the broke old lady who'd never accomplished anything, who'd never built anything worth mentioning, who was just barely scraping by on whatever modest savings she had left. The morning everything changed started like any other. I'd woken at 6, made my instant coffee, noticed the main house lights already on, walked across the wet grass in my old slippers because it had rained overnight and the path was slick, let myself in through the back door using the key Diana had given me, one of those cheap copies that stuck in the lock, found Diana in the kitchen wearing athleisure clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was on the phone with someone, laughing, didn't acknowledge me as I started loading the dishwasher from last night's dinner. A dinner I hadn't been invited to even though I'd been home, even though I'd heard them laughing and talking through my thin walls. And I'd learned not to feel hurt about these exclusions, learned to smile and nod and pretend I didn't notice. But this morning, as I scraped congealed pasta off expensive plates, I heard Diana say something that made my hands freeze. She was talking to her mother, speaker on, Susan's voice tinny but clear, and they were discussing me, planning something. Diana was saying she'd finally convinced Marcus they needed to talk to me about moving into assisted living, that she'd found a nice facility, very affordable, only $2,500 a month, and Susan had laughed, said that sounded perfect, that Diana had been patient long enough, that it was time to reclaim their space and their privacy, and Diana had agreed, said she'd already cleared out most of my things from the guest house, was planning to convert it into a home gym, just needed to figure out how to break the news to me gently, make it seem like it was for my own good, and Susan had said, "Don't worry, darling. Old people always resist change, but eventually they see reason, especially when they have no other options, especially when they're broke." And they'd both laughed, actually laughed, like my displacement was amusing, and I'd stood there holding a dirty plate, soap suds dripping onto my old cardigan, feeling something inside me shift, not break, but transform, like ice turning to steel. I finished loading the dishwasher in silence, Diana still on the phone, still planning my removal as if I weren't standing 10 feet away, and I realized she truly didn't see me as a person anymore, just an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, and when she finally hung up and turned around, startled, to find me there, she'd recovered quickly, smiled that practice smile and said, "Oh, Eleanor, I didn't hear you come in. There's laundry in the dryer that needs folding." And I'd nodded, said of course. Walked to the laundry room where I'd folded their clothes, Marcus's work shirts and Diana's expensive yoga pants, and I'd made a decision. Not born from anger exactly, but from clarity, from finally seeing the situation for what it was. I was being erased from my own life, slowly and systematically. And if I didn't act soon, there'd be nothing left of me but a footnote in Marcus's memory. The mother who'd lived in the guest house until they'd moved her somewhere more appropriate. That afternoon, while Diana was at her Pilates class, I'd driven to the storage unit I'd been renting since I'd sold the house to Marcus, the unit where I'd kept everything that mattered: Arthur's papers, my business records, the documents from Hartwell Distribution, including personnel files and the incident report from the Walsh theft. I'd kept everything because Arthur had taught me that paper trails mattered, that documentation was protection, and I'd spent 2 hours going through boxes until I found what I needed, the file labeled Walsh, Richard and Walsh, Susan. Inside were their original employment applications with social security numbers and previous addresses, the inventory discrepancy reports our accountant had compiled, the security camera screenshots showing them loading stolen merchandise, my handwritten notes from the confrontation in my office, and their signed resignation letters that included a clause stating they acknowledged the theft allegations and agreed not to contest their termination in exchange for no prosecution. It was all there, dated and documented, proof that 23 years ago, the Walshes had been thieves who'd begged for mercy. And I'd made copies of everything, organized it into a clean folder, then driven home feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years: purpose. Sunday arrived with its usual ritual: Richard and Susan's black Mercedes pulling up at 11, Diana rushing out to greet them, expensive wine and gourmet cheese in their hands. And I was in the kitchen preparing the appetizer spread Diana had requested: prosciutto and melon, caprese skewers, artisan crackers with 3 kinds of cheese, my hands moving automatically through tasks I'd done dozens of times. But this Sunday was different, because tucked into my cardigan pocket was the folder, slim and unassuming, containing everything that would shatter Diana's perfect narrative. I'd decided last night that I was done being invisible, done being the broke old lady, done pretending their history wasn't also my history. And when they called me into the living room to serve drinks, I'd walked in carrying my tray, but also carrying truth. They were settled in their usual spots: Richard in the leather armchair that used to be Arthur's favorite, Susan on the sofa beside Diana. Marcus not home yet from his morning run, and I'd set down the tray, poured their wine with steady hands, and Susan had barely glanced at me before launching into a story about their latest property development, a luxury condo complex downtown, talking about square footage and amenities and projected returns, and Diana was hanging on every word, asking questions, taking mental notes, probably imagining herself living that life someday. And Richard was nodding along, adding details, his expensive watch catching the light, and I'd stood there holding the empty tray thinking about the night I'd caught them loading stolen inventory into their trunk. How different they'd looked then, younger and desperate and terrified. And I'd cleared my throat, said, "Excuse me, I have something I'd like to share." And they'd all looked at me with varying degrees of surprise and annoyance, Diana's face particularly sharp, as if I'd violated some unspoken rule about speaking unless spoken to. And Susan had said in that patronizing tone, "Older people perfect." "Yes, Eleanor. What is it? Make it quick, darling. We're in the middle of something." And I'd smiled, reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the folder, and said I was going through some old business papers and found something interesting. Something about you, Richard, and Susan. And the room had gone very still, that particular stillness that comes right before revelation. Richard's hand frozen halfway to his wine glass. Susan's smile locked in place, but her eyes suddenly alert, and Diana looking between us confused, saying, "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" And I'd opened the folder, pulled out the first document, the security camera screenshot showing a younger Richard loading a box into his trunk, timestamp visible, date clear, and I'd said, "This is from October 15th, 1999, warehouse security camera, Hartwell Distribution, my company, where you both worked." And I'd watched Richard's face drain of color, watched Susan's mouth open slightly, watched understanding dawn in their eyes, the recognition they should have shown 3 years ago, finally arriving. Diana had snatched the paper from my hands, staring at it, saying, "What is this? This doesn't make sense." And I'd calmly pulled out another document, the inventory discrepancy report, then another, their employment applications, then the resignation letters with their signatures acknowledging the theft. And I'd laid them out on the coffee table like cards in a game, each one a piece of their carefully constructed lie. And Susan had started to say, "Now, Eleanor, let's not do this," but I'd cut her off, my voice steady and clear. Said, "Let me tell everyone what really happened. 23 years ago, Richard and Susan worked for me and my late husband Arthur at Hartwell Distribution. We'd hired them as assistant warehouse managers, trusted them with inventory access, and over 6 months they stole approximately $30,000 worth of merchandise, reselling it for personal profit. We caught them on camera, confronted them, and they begged us not to prosecute. Susan was pregnant with her first child. You, actually." I'd looked at Diana, who was staring at her mother with growing horror, and I'd continued, I chose mercy, let them resign quietly, no charges filed, no public scandal. I gave them a second chance to build their lives the right way, and apparently they did. Built quite an empire, in fact. Just never mentioned where the seed money came from. And the room had exploded. Diana shouting that I was lying, that I was a bitter old woman making things up. Richard on his feet saying those documents were falsified. Susan crying that this was ancient history that shouldn't matter. And I'd stood there calm as glass, said the documents are real, the dates can be verified, the company sale records show Hartwell Distribution existed, and when it was sold, my accountant from that time is still alive and practicing. The security company that installed our cameras still has records. Everything I'm saying can be proven. And I'd looked directly at Richard and Susan and said, "You know it's true. You remember begging me in my office. You remember Susan crying about the baby. You remember me choosing not to destroy your lives, and they'd gone silent. Susan's hands trembling. Richard's jaw working, but no words coming out. And Diana had looked at her parents, said, 'Tell her she's wrong. Tell her this is crazy.' And the silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus had arrived home then, walking into chaos. Diana immediately grabbing him, showing him the documents, saying your mother is making insane accusations about my parents. And Marcus had looked at me confused, said, 'Mom, what's going on?' And I'd said, 'Sit down, son. There's something you need to know about the people Diana's been comparing me to, about the empire they supposedly built from nothing.' And over the next 20 minutes, I'd told him everything, Arthur's and my history. Building Hartwell Distribution, hiring the Walshes, discovering the theft, the confrontation, the choice I'd made. And I'd shown him every document, let him read their resignation letters with his own eyes, let him see the security photos, the inventory reports, the accountant's findings. And I'd watched his face change as he understood, as he realized the perfect in-laws Diana had held up as examples of success had started their fortune with stolen money. And Diana had been crying, shouting that it didn't matter, that it was so long ago, that her parents had built their success through hard work after that one mistake. And I'd agreed, said, yes, they did build something. Good for them, redemption is possible, growth is real. But the narrative you've been selling, the one where they started with nothing, worked their way up through pure merit, that's a lie. They started with $30,000 of stolen inventory from my company, and every time you've compared them to me, every time you've made me feel small and broke and unsuccessful, you were worshiping people who only got their start because I chose not to prosecute them. And the look on Diana's face had been worth every moment of the last 3 years, the humiliation, the erasure, the loneliness, all of it worth seeing her perfect story crumble. Richard had tried to leave, Susan already at the door, but Marcus had blocked them, said, "We're not done here," and his voice had carried an authority I'd rarely heard, and he'd turned to Diana and said, "Is this why you wanted my mother in assisted living? Why you cleared out her things? Why you've treated her like hired help? Because your parents made her feel inferior," and Diana had stammered, said it wasn't like that, but Marcus had kept going, said my mother built a company from nothing, sold it for millions, gave me everything I needed growing up, supported me through college, and she's been living in a converted garage while you remodeled her house and planned to kick her out, and I'd touched his arm. Said Marcus, "It's okay?" But he'd shaken his head, said, "No, Mom, it's not okay. None of this is okay." And he'd looked at Diana with something I'd never seen before, disappointment so deep it might have been disgust. The Walshes had left within minutes, Susan's face buried in her hands as Richard practically dragged her to their Mercedes, and Diana had followed them outside, begging them to stay, to explain, to tell her I was lying. But they'd driven away without looking back, and Diana had come back inside trembling, makeup smeared, and she'd looked at me with pure hatred, said, You've destroyed everything. My relationship with my parents, my marriage, my life. All because you couldn't let go of something that happened before I was born." And I'd said quietly, "I didn't destroy anything, Diana. I just told the truth. The truth you would have heard years ago if your parents had been honest, if they'd owned their past instead of rewriting it." And she'd screamed, said she'd never forgive me, that Marcus would have to choose between his wife and his mother, and she'd run upstairs, slammed their bedroom door. And Marcus and I had been left standing in the living room, surrounded by papers and destroyed illusions. We'd sat on the sofa, just the two of us, and Marcus had said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have seen it. Should have stopped Diana from treating you that way." And I'd shook my head, said, "You loved your wife. You wanted to make her happy. There's no shame in that." And he'd said, "But she made you live in a garage, made you clean and cook and serve her parents like you were staff, and you never said anything. Why didn't you tell me?" And I'd tried to explain that it had happened gradually, small erosions of dignity that accumulated until I'd barely recognized my own life, and that I'd stayed quiet because I'd thought maybe if I was patient, if I was helpful, if I was small enough, Diana would see my value, would let me be part of their life. But instead, I'd just become more invisible, and Marcus had started crying. Actual tears, said he'd been blind, wrapped up in work and trying to keep Diana happy, and he'd failed me, failed Arthur's memory, failed everything our family was supposed to be, and I'd held my son while he wept. This grown man who looked so much like his father, and I'd felt my heart crack open with love and grief because I'd gotten my son back, but I'd lost years I could never recover. Diana had emerged an hour later, bags packed, face cold, and she'd said she was staying with a friend, that she needed space, that she couldn't be in the house with me there. And Marcus had said, "Fine, take your space, but you should know when you come back, things are going to be different. My mother isn't living in the guest house anymore. She's moving back into the main house, into her bedroom, and we'll figure out new arrangements." And Diana had laughed, bitter and sharp, said, "You're choosing her over me?" And Marcus had said, "I'm choosing what's right, something I should have done a long time ago." And she'd left, the door slamming behind her, and the house had gone quiet, that terrible quiet after a storm. That night, Marcus and I had sat in the kitchen where Diana had ordered me around for 3 years, and we'd talked until sunrise about Arthur, about Hartwell distribution, about the choices I'd made, about mercy and consequences, about how sometimes the people we save don't stay saved, how they rewrite their histories and forget the hands that pulled them back from the edge. And Marcus had asked why I'd kept the documents all these years, what I'd planned to do with them. And I'd said, honestly, I'd forgotten they existed until recently. Until I'd needed to remember who I was before I'd let Diana make me small, before I'd accepted being the broke old lady. And I'd gone looking for proof that I'd been someone once, someone who'd built things and made hard choices and survived. And I'd found those papers and realized they were more than just records. They were a kind of weapon. Not for revenge exactly, but for truth. And I'd known I couldn't keep living as someone's burden, someone's problem to solve. I'd needed to reclaim my story. And if that meant destroying Diana's illusions about her parents, then so was it, because my truth mattered more than their comfort. The next few days had been strange. Marcus had taken time off work. We'd moved my belongings back into the main house, into the master bedroom I'd shared with Arthur. And it had felt like coming home, like breathing after being underwater. Diana had called twice, but Marcus hadn't answered. Had told her through text that when she was ready to apologize to me and discuss boundaries, they could talk, but not before. And apparently she wasn't ready, because the calls stopped, and life had continued in this odd, suspended state. Just Marcus and me in the house where I'd raised him, cooking meals together, watching old movies, sorting through Arthur's things I'd packed away years ago, and it had been healing in a way I hadn't expected. This return to simplicity, to family without the toxic overlay Diana had brought. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Richard Walsh had shown up at the door alone, looking older somehow, diminished. And when Marcus had opened the door, he'd said, "I'm here to speak with Eleanor." And Marcus had called me down, stayed close though, protective, and Richard and I had faced each other in the foyer. This man who'd stolen from me, who'd let his daughter diminish me for years, who'd rewritten history to erase his shame, and he'd said, "I owe you an explanation, maybe an apology, I'm not sure which." And I'd said, "You don't owe me anything, Richard. You paid your debt by staying away, by building something legitimate. The only thing you owed me was honesty, and you chose silence instead." And he'd nodded, said, "When we saw you at Marcus and Diana's engagement party, we recognized you immediately. We'd hoped you wouldn't remember us. 23 years is a long time. People change. We'd changed. We weren't those desperate thieves anymore. We'd built a real business, paid our taxes, became respectable. But we were terrified you'd expose us, ruin Diana's happiness. So we just played along, pretended we'd never met." And I'd asked why he'd let Diana treat me the way she did. If he'd recognized me, why not intervene? And he'd looked ashamed, said, "Because you were a reminder of our worst moment. Seeing you made us remember what we'd done, who we'd been. And it was easier to let Diana diminish you than to confront our own guilt. We told ourselves you were fine. You'd sold your company for millions. You didn't need protection or respect from us. We convinced ourselves we didn't owe you anything, and I'd said you were right about one thing. You didn't owe me anything, but common decency isn't a debt, Richard. It's just basic humanity, something you and Susan forgot," and he'd agreed. Said he knew that now. Said Diana had barely spoken to them since the truth came out, that their relationship with their daughter was fractured, maybe permanently, and he'd asked if I'd consider talking to her, helping her understand that her parents weren't monsters, just flawed people who'd made mistakes, and I'd said no. That's not my job. You and Susan need to own your history with Diana, need to tell her the whole story, not just the parts that make you look sympathetic. And if she chooses to forgive you, that's her decision. But I'm done mediating other people's relationships, done making myself small so others can feel big, and Richard had accepted that, had thanked me quietly, had left looking like a man carrying weight he couldn't put down. Susan never came, never called. I'd heard through Marcus, who'd heard through Diana, that Susan was seeing a therapist, processing shame and guilt, that the revelation had cracked something open in her, forced her to confront decades of buried history. And I'd felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy, just a kind of weary recognition that pain ripples outward, touches everyone eventually. That my choice 23 years ago to show mercy had saved them from prosecution, but couldn't save them from themselves, couldn't prevent the rot that comes from living a lie. And now they were dealing with consequences I couldn't have predicted, their daughter's trust broken, their carefully constructed image shattered, their past finally catching up. And I'd done that. I'd pulled the thread that unraveled everything, and I'd asked myself late at night if that made me vindictive, if I should have stayed quiet, if mercy meant accepting erasure. And I'd decided no. Mercy was what I'd given 23 years ago, what I'd given them for 3 years after recognizing them, staying silent while they pretended superiority. Silence was mercy, and they'd wasted it, used it as license to diminish me. So the truth wasn't cruelty, it was justice, delayed, but arriving nonetheless. Marcus and Diana had started counseling, both individual and couples. Diana apparently working through complicated feelings about her parents, about their lies, about whether their success was legitimate or forever tainted, and Marcus dealing with guilt over failing to protect me. over choosing Diana's happiness over my dignity, and I'd told him during one of our kitchen talks that he hadn't failed me, that love makes people blind sometimes, that I understood, but he'd insisted he'd seen the signs and ignored them. The way Diana spoke to me, the way she'd isolated me, the casual cruelty disguised as efficiency. And he'd chosen peace over confrontation, chosen his marriage over his mother, and he'd live with that. But he'd never make that choice again, and I'd believed him because some lessons only stick when they cost something. I know what you're thinking right now. Some of you are nodding. Others are judging me hard, wondering if I'm a bitter old woman who weaponized ancient history to destroy my daughter-in-law's relationship with her parents. Drop a comment with your honest reaction, Team Eleanor or Team Diana. I genuinely need to know if I was justified, if staying silent would have been nobler, or if truth, no matter how destructive, deserves its day, because here's what keeps me up at night. Diana's pain is real. Her sense of betrayal is real. Her parents lied to her about who they were, and I exposed that lie not just to clear my own name, but because I was tired of being small. And maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe that makes me cruel. But I couldn't keep living as the broke old lady when I'd built more than the Walshes ever had. When my silence was the only thing protecting their false narrative, so I spoke, and relationships shattered. And I'm not sure yet if that was justice or just revenge dressed in truth's clothing. Keep that thought. I'll finish the story. 3 months after the revelation, Diana had finally asked to meet me, not at the house but at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. And I'd agreed because Marcus had asked me to, because he'd said Diana was trying to work through things, was starting to understand the complexity of what had happened, and maybe a conversation would help. So I'd gone, arrived early, ordered chamomile tea, sat by the window watching people pass. And when Diana arrived, she'd looked different, smaller somehow, less polished. Her hair in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual carefully curated outfits. And she'd sat across from me and said, "Thank you for coming." And I'd nodded, said, "Of course," and we'd sat in awkward silence until she'd finally said, "I've been in therapy twice a week trying to understand why I treated you the way I did. And my therapist thinks it's complicated, thinks I was performing for my parents, trying to prove I'd married well, that I was successful, that I didn't need their money anymore. And the only way I knew how to show success was by having help, by having someone beneath me. And you were the easiest target, and I'd listened, my tea going cold, as she'd continued. Said she'd been raised to measure worth by accomplishment and wealth, that her parents had drilled into her that struggle was shameful, that poverty was a moral failing, that successful people helped unsuccessful people out of charity, not obligation. And she'd internalized all of it, used it as armor against her own insecurity. And when she'd met Marcus and learned his mother lived modestly, didn't work, seemed dependent, she'd unconsciously categorized me as lesser, as someone who'd failed at life, and that made her feel superior, made her feel like she'd succeeded where I'd failed, and the revelation about her parents had destroyed that framework, made her question everything she'd believed about success and worth, and who deserved respect. I'd asked if her parents had explained themselves, told her the full story, and Diana had nodded, said they'd spent hours talking, her father crying, which she'd never seen before, her mother apologizing, both of them admitting they'd been terrified for years that their past would resurface, that they'd built their empire honestly after the theft, but could never fully escape what they'd done, and they'd chosen silence and pretense over honesty, and that choice had shaped how they'd raised Diana, taught her to value appearance over authenticity, success over integrity. And now she was unlearning all of it, trying to figure out who she was beneath the performance, and it was hard, painful, destabilizing, And I'd said quietly that I was sorry she was hurting, but not sorry I'd told the truth. That she'd needed to know who her parents really were. And she'd agreed. Said she did need to know. Even though the knowing had broken something fundamental in her understanding of her life. And we'd talked for 2 hours. Not fixing anything exactly, but airing grievances, establishing baseline honesty. And at the end, Diana had said, "I won't ask you to forgive me because I don't deserve it yet, but I want you to know I'm working on becoming someone who treats people with dignity regardless of their bank account or status. And that starts with apologizing for every cruel thing I said. Every task I assigned you like you were staff. Every moment I made you feel small. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Truly sorry." And I'd accepted her apology, not because it fixed the past, but because forward required acknowledging what had been. Marcus had been hopeful after that meeting, had thought maybe we could all find a way forward, and slowly we did. Diana moved back home, but into one of the spare bedrooms, she and Marcus working on their marriage but living separately within the house. And I'd stayed in the master bedroom, my bedroom, with Arthur's pictures on the dresser and my sewing machine by the window, where I'd started taking commissions again, alterations and custom pieces. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed purpose beyond being someone's mother or someone's burden. And the work had been meditative, satisfying, each stitch a reclamation of identity. And Diana had asked one day if I'd teach her to sew, and I'd been surprised but agreed. And we'd spent Saturday afternoons at my machine, Diana learning basic stitches, me teaching her the way my own mother had taught me. And it became a bridge between us. This shared activity that had nothing to do with her parents or history or hurt. Just two women making something with their hands. And slowly, glacially, our relationship shifted from hostility to something approaching friendship. Tentative and fragile, but real. The Walshes sold their real estate company 6 months after the revelation. Retired early, Richard said it was planned, but Marcus told me privately he'd heard they'd lost several major clients after whispers about their history started circulating. Apparently someone who'd known them back then had connected the dots, recognized their names, shared the story, and the business community, which valued reputation above all, had quietly distanced itself, and the Walshes had gotten out while they could, sold to a larger firm, took their money, and bought a house in Arizona, far from New York, far from their history, far from Diana who'd chosen to stay and rebuild rather than run, and I'd felt neither vindication nor pity, just a kind of tired acceptance that consequences arrive in their own time, that mercy delayed isn't mercy denied, that the truth I'd told had rippled farther than I'd expected, touching lives I'd never meet, reshaping narratives I'd never hear, and I'd had to sit with that, had to accept that speaking truth is powerful and power carries responsibility. And I'd tried to wield it carefully, but couldn't control where it went or what it destroyed. And maybe that was the final lesson, that truth isn't a scalpel, it's a flood. And once released, it goes everywhere, drowning some things, cleansing others, and you can't predict which. Diana had eventually reconciled with her parents, but differently. They talked weekly, but the blind worship was gone, replaced by something more mature, adult love with clear eyes, seeing flaws and choosing connection anyway. And Diana told me once that she was grateful for that shift even though it hurt, that loving imperfect people honestly was harder, but more real than loving perfect illusions. And she'd thanked me, said I'd given her that gift, even though it hadn't felt like a gift at the time. And I'd understood what she meant. Sometimes the most valuable things come wrapped in pain, and you can't appreciate the gift until the pain fades enough to see clearly. Marcus and Diana had renewed their vows on their 5th anniversary, small ceremony, just family and close friends, and they'd written new vows that acknowledged their failures, their growth, their commitment to honesty even when it hurt. And I'd stood beside them holding Arthur's pocket watch, the one Marcus had carried on his original wedding day. And I'd thought about how marriage is less about the promises you make, than the promises you keep after everything tries to break them. And these two had been broken, badly. But they'd chosen repair over replacement, and that took courage. The kind that only comes after you've seen the worst of yourself and decided to be better. And I'd watch them kiss, watch their faces glow with hard-won love, and I'd felt proud. Not just of Marcus, but of Diana too. Of the woman she was becoming. The woman who could look at her own cruelty and choose change, and that was rare. Most people defend their worst selves forever. But Diana had let herself be transformed by truth, and that was worth celebrating. I moved out of the main house a year later. Not because anyone pushed me, but because I'd found a beautiful condo downtown, 2 bedrooms, lots of light, close to fabric stores and cafes, and I'd realized I didn't want to live in the past anymore. Didn't want to sleep in the room I'd shared with Arthur, or walk hallways haunted by who I used to be. I wanted something new, something mine, something chosen, not inherited. And Marcus had understood, had helped me move, had said he was glad I was building a life that was fully mine. And Diana had cried, surprising both of us, said she'd miss having me close, and I'd said I'd visit every Sunday. We could cook together, or sew, or just talk. And that had comforted her, knowing the connection would continue even though the proximity changed. And on moving day, when I'd stood in my new living room, boxes stacked high, windows open to city sounds, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in years, excitement for what came next, for the story that was still being written, for the woman I was still becoming even at 68. And Arthur's voice had come to me, not as memory exactly, but as presence, saying, "You did good, Eleanor. You stood up. You told the truth. You loved everyone involved enough to refuse their lies, and that's legacy. Not the company we built, or the money we made, but the spine you showed when it would have been easier to stay silent." And I'd smiled, had said out loud to the empty room, "I miss you, Arthur, but I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." And I'd meant it. The sewing business had grown, word of mouth bringing clients, custom wedding dresses mostly, the irony not lost on me. And I'd found myself working with young brides, hearing their hopes and fears, stitching dreams into fabric. And each dress was different, each woman unique, and I'd started seeing patterns in what they wanted. The ones who wanted to disappear into tradition, the ones who wanted to stand out, the ones who wanted to look beautiful for themselves versus for others. And I'd learned to ask questions, to understand not just measurements, but motivations. And the work became almost therapeutic, not just for them, but for me. Each stitch a meditation on love and hope, and the courage it takes to stand in front of everyone you know and say, "This is who I choose. This is my life." And I'd think about my own wedding to Arthur. How young we'd been, how naive, how certain that love would be enough. And it had been enough, barely. We'd made it enough through work and compromise and sheer stubborn commitment. And I'd wish I could tell these young brides that marriage is less romance than endurance, less passion than partnership. But they weren't ready to hear that. Nobody is at 25, so I'd just make their dresses perfect, give them their fairy tale moment, and hope they'd figure out the rest. Diana gave birth to my first grandchild, a girl named Eleanor, on a cold March morning 2 years after our coffee shop conversation. And when Marcus called to tell me, his voice shaking with joy, I'd driven to the hospital in my old reliable car, the one I'd never replaced despite having money for something newer, because it ran fine and I'd never cared about impressing anyone with cars. And I'd held that baby, looked into her dark eyes, seen Arthur's mother's face, my own mother's nose. Generations of women compressed into this tiny person who knew nothing of theft or betrayal or complicated family history. And I'd whispered to her, "Welcome, little one. You're named after a woman who learned late but learned true that your worth isn't what others say it is. It's what you know yourself to be." And Diana had watched from the hospital bed, still exhausted, and she'd said I wanted her to have a strong name, a name that meant something, and Eleanor means light. And I'd cried, actual tears, because despite everything, Diana had become someone who understood symbolism and significance, who'd chosen to honor me in the most permanent way possible. And Marcus had put his arm around me, said Mom, "You're going to be an amazing grandmother." And I'd said I'll try to be what I needed and never had, present, honest, someone who sees her fully, and that became my promise, my purpose. This next chapter of teaching my granddaughter through action, not words, that dignity is a choice, that truth matters more than comfort, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's lie. Sunday dinners became tradition. Marcus, Diana, baby Eleanor, and me gathered around the table in my condo, and we'd cook together, tell stories, laugh about things that once hurt. And Diana would ask me about Hartwell Distribution, about building the company, about the early years with Arthur, and I'd tell her, share the struggles and small victories, the near bankruptcies and last-minute saves, and Marcus would add details he'd forgotten, pieces of his childhood colored by business stress I'd tried to hide, and Diana would listen, really listen. And I'd see her trying to understand the woman I'd been before she'd made me small, trying to reconcile her image of the broke old lady with the reality of someone who'd built and sold $1 million company, and slowly that reconciliation happened. Slowly, Diana began to see me as complete, not just Marcus's mother or her burden, but as Eleanor, fully dimensional, complicated, flawed, strong, and that seeing mattered more than any apology. Richard called once a year, on the anniversary of the confrontation. Always the same day, and he'd say, "Hello, Eleanor. Just wanted to let you know Susan and I are well. We think of you often. We're grateful for the mercy you showed us twice. Once when you didn't prosecute, and once when you could have destroyed us completely, but chose measured truth instead. And I'd say, I'm glad you're well, Richard. I hope you found peace." And he'd say, "We're working on it. It's a process." And then we'd hang up, and I'd wonder if he really understood that I hadn't chosen measured truth. I'd just told what happened and couldn't control the fallout. But maybe he needed to believe I'd been strategic, merciful, intentional, rather than just exhausted and done with silence. And I'd let him believe it, because everyone needs a narrative that makes sense of their pain. And if Richard needed me to be wise and calculated rather than just human and tired, that was fine, his story to tell. Marcus got promoted to senior architect, started his own small firm, and one of his first projects was renovating community centers in underserved neighborhoods. And when I asked him why that focus, he'd said, because success that doesn't give back isn't success at all. It's just accumulation. And I'd recognized my own words, things I'd said years ago when he was young, about responsibility and privilege. And I'd realized that children absorb more than we think, that the lessons we model matter more than the lessons we preach. And everything I'd lived had taught him something even when I thought he wasn't watching. And that was legacy too. Not just the money or the company, but the values that survived their transmission. The principles that took root and grew. I'm 71 now. Eleanor is 3, and already showing signs of her grandmother's stubbornness. Diana jokes that she's my perfect clone, and I take it as a compliment. And my sewing room is full of projects, wedding dresses, and baby clothes and quilts for friends who've become family. And my life is small in scope, but large in meaning. And I've learned that's what matters. Not the size of your impact, but its depth. Not how many people know your name, but how few people you've loved completely. And I think about that night, I pulled out the documents, the choice to speak truth that changed everything. And I still don't know if I was right. If the destruction I caused was justified by the honesty I claimed. But I know I couldn't have kept living as someone's broke old lady, couldn't have kept accepting invisibility. and speaking cost me nothing I wanted to keep and gave me back everything that mattered. My son's respect, my own dignity, the space to be fully myself. And maybe that's selfish. Maybe that's heroic. Maybe it's both. But it's mine. My choice. My consequence. My life reclaimed. And I'm still here. Still stitching. Still teaching my granddaughter that truth is complicated, but silence is corrosive. And someday, when she's old enough, I'll tell her this story. Tell her about the Walshes and the theft and the years of silence and the day I finally spoke. And I'll ask her what she thinks. Was I right? Was I wrong? Does it matter when the outcome is survival and she'll make her own judgment as you're making yours now? And that's how it should be. Everyone deciding for themselves what justice looks like, what mercy costs, what truth demands. So here's my question to you. Now that you know everything, Team Eleanor or Team Diana, was I justified in exposing the Walshes' history, even though it destroyed Diana's relationship with her parents and shattered her understanding of her own life? Or should I have stayed silent, let them keep their lies, accepted my role as the broke old lady to preserve Diana's peace? Drop your honest answer in the comments because I read every single one. I want to know if you think truth is always worth telling or if some lies are kinder than honesty. And next week, I'll be back with another story. This time from Diana's perspective. Her side of everything that happened, because every story has multiple truths, and maybe you'll judge differently when you hear hers. And if you want more confessions like this, stories about family and betrayal, and the complicated math of love and forgiveness, subscribe because I'm not done talking. Not done examining these moments where we choose who we are. And I need you here. Need your judgment. Need your witness. Because isn't that what confession is? An offering to strangers who might understand better than the people who were there. So stay with me. More truth coming. More questions. More stories where I'm not sure if I'm the hero or the villain. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we're all both.